In the early summer of 1942, amid the vast and unending waters of the Pacific Ocean, a confrontation took place that would alter the course of the Second World War and redefine the balance of power between two great nations. The Battle of Midway, fought between the 4th and 7th of June, was not simply another clash between fleets. It was a complex test of intelligence, technology, courage, and luck that transformed the Pacific War from Japanese dominance to a slow but inevitable American advance. To understand Midway, one must first look at the situation following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 months earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had launched a devastating blow that crippled the United States Pacific Fleet. Battleships lay wrecked or burning in the shallow waters of Hawaii, and thousands of sailors and airmen had perished in what was, at that time, the worst military disaster in American history.
The Japanese strategy, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was to knock out the United States before its immense industrial might could be brought to bear. For a brief moment, that strategy worked brilliantly. Japan's forces swept through the Pacific and Southeast Asia like an unstoppable tide. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies fell one after another. The rising sun flag flew from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Yet within the Imperial Navy's headquarters, Yamamoto knew that these victories were temporary. Japan lacked the natural resources to sustain a long war. Its enemies, particularly the United States, possessed a level of manufacturing capacity and access to oil and steel that Japan could not hope to match. Therefore, Japan's only hope was to destroy America's remaining naval power in one decisive encounter and force Washington to negotiate. That encounter, Yamamoto decided, would occur near a tiny atoll called Midway. Situated roughly halfway between Hawaii and Japan, Midway was little more than a pair of coral islands barely rising above sea level, but it possessed an airstrip, fuel depots, and a small garrison of U.S. Marines. More importantly, it lay within striking distance of Pearl Harbor. If captured, Midway could serve as a base from which Japan might threaten Hawaii directly or lure the American carriers into a final, fatal trap. Yamamoto's plan was ambitious and extraordinarily complex. He would send a diversionary force to attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, hoping to draw part of the U.S. fleet northward. Meanwhile, his main attack force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would strike Midway from the west with 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying over 200 bombers and fighters. Once Midway's defenses were smashed, an invasion force would occupy the atoll. When the American carriers rushed in to respond, Nagumo would destroy them, thereby ensuring Japan's control of the Pacific.
It was, in Yamamoto's mind, a perfect plan. But perfection in war depends not only on planning, but also on what the enemy knows. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, a group of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been working tirelessly for months to break the Japanese naval code, JN-25. Piece by piece, through patience and ingenuity, they had succeeded in deciphering enough of the messages to predict future operations. In May 1942, they intercepted communications indicating that an operation, codenamed AF, was being planned. The question was, what did AF refer to? To find out, Rochefort's team suggested sending a fake message from Midway, claiming that the island's water purification system had failed. A short time later, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was running low on fresh water. The ruse worked perfectly. Now the Americans knew that Midway was the target. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, prepared to turn Yamamoto's trap against him. He could not match Japan ship for ship, but he could exploit the element of surprise. Nimitz gathered his 3 available carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, and deployed them northeast of Midway, in a position invisible to Japanese reconnaissance. The Yorktown had been damaged just weeks earlier during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yet, through extraordinary effort, the Pearl Harbor shipyard workers repaired her in only 72 hours. On June 2, she joined the task force under Rear Admiral Frank "Jack" Fletcher. Together with Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance's Task Force 16, they formed a striking power that, though smaller, was ready for battle. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, was immense and confident. Its pilots were among the best in the world, veterans of years of combat over China and the Pacific.
The crews of Akagi and Kaga believed they were invincible. After all, they had triumphed at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the Coral Sea. Their aircraft, Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers, and Daiichi D38 dive bombers, were superbly engineered and battle-tested. As Yamamoto's armada moved eastward under radio silence, the sea seemed calm, the future certain. The Imperial Japanese Navy had every reason to expect another brilliant victory. On Midway Island, however, the Americans were anything but calm. The garrison consisted of roughly 3,000 men, including Marines, Navy personnel, and civilian contractors. They worked feverishly to strengthen defenses, digging trenches, positioning anti-aircraft guns, and camouflaging installations. The airstrip buzzed with activity as Marine Fighter Squadron 221 prepared its Brewster Buffalo and Grumman Wildcat fighters, while Army Air Force bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-26 Marauders stood ready to strike at the approaching enemy. For the men stationed there, Midway was little more than a speck of coral and sand, but in the days to come, it would become the center of the world's attention. On June 3rd, American reconnaissance planes spotted elements of the approaching Japanese invasion force. PBY Catalina flying boats from Midway made contact reports, confirming Nimitz's expectations. Early that morning, American bombers launched an attack on the Japanese transports, but failed to score any hits. The sky was filled with streaks of anti-aircraft fire, tracer rounds, and the roar of engines. Though the raid achieved little, it proved that Midway's defenders were ready.
Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown steamed quietly through the night, maintaining radio silence. Their crews waited in tense anticipation, knowing that within hours, history would hinge on their actions. Dawn broke on June 4, 1942, clear and bright over the Pacific. At 0430 hours, Nagumo launched his first wave of 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters toward Midway. The sun glinted off their wings as they rose into the sky, engines roaring. The Japanese strike force, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, swept toward the island in perfect formation. At 0615, they reached Midway and began their assault. Bombs rained down on the runways, fuel tanks, and gun emplacements. The island shook under the impact. Marine anti-aircraft gunners fired furiously, their guns overheating as they tried to repel the attack. Smoke and fire engulfed the airfield, yet Midway's defenses held. Many of the Japanese bombs missed their targets, and several attacking aircraft were shot down by Marine pilots and gunners. The radio operator on the island transmitted a brief message to Pearl Harbor. "Many planes attacking us. We are being bombed." It was the signal Nimitz had been waiting for. At sea, American carrier pilots scrambled to their aircraft. Squadrons of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters began to take off, heading toward the last known position of Nagumo's fleet. But the ocean is vast, and locating moving ships was a challenge even for experienced aviators.
Many would not return. As Nagumo's strike force returned to their carriers around 0700, they reported that a second strike would be needed to neutralize Midway's defenses. Nagumo faced a difficult decision. His aircraft were still armed for anti-ship operations in case American carriers appeared, but now he was under pressure to rearm them for another attack on Midway. As his crews began switching torpedoes for bombs below deck, word came from a scout plane that American ships had been sighted to the northeast. It was the moment on which the entire battle would turn. Should Nagumo strike Midway again, or attack the approaching carriers? The confusion, conflicting reports, and the need to recover and refuel his returning aircraft delayed his decision. Below deck, hangars filled with fuel hoses, bombs, and torpedoes created a volatile environment, a floating powder keg waiting for a spark. As the Japanese fleet maneuvered, American torpedo squadrons arrived in waves. The first, from the Hornet, launched a brave but doomed attack. Flying low and slow in obsolete TBD Devastator bombers, they pressed home their assault against withering fire from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Out of the 15 aircraft, none scored a hit. Only a handful of pilots survived. Next came the Yorktown's torpedo squadron, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Before takeoff, Waldron had told his men, "If we don't get through, somebody else will. Tell them to go in and get them." They too were cut down almost to the last man. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Their desperate attacks drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the skies above momentarily unguarded. It was then, at approximately 10:20 hours, that dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown arrived overhead, guided by sheer luck and determination. What followed would become one of the most decisive moments in naval history.
The sky above the Pacific that morning was filled with smoke, fire, and chaos as the Battle of Midway reached its critical hour. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu maneuvered violently as American torpedo bombers had made their suicidal runs. Yet in their wake, the air defenses of the Imperial Japanese Navy were in disarray. The decks of the carriers were cluttered with refueling aircraft, bombs, and torpedoes as crews hurried to rearm for another strike against Midway or the approaching American ships. It was precisely this moment of confusion that fate, or rather the calculated risks of Admiral Nimitz and his aviators, had been waiting for. Above the clouds, high at 20,000 feet, the pilots of U.S. Navy dive bomber squadrons from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown searched desperately for the enemy. Commander C. Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's air group, had been flying in widening circles, running low on fuel, his men growing anxious. Then, by chance, McCluskey spotted the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, speeding north at full throttle. The destroyer had fallen behind while attacking a U.S. submarine and was now racing to rejoin the main fleet. Realizing that it could only be heading toward Nagumo's carriers, McCluskey followed it, and in doing so, changed the course of the war. Within minutes, the American dive bombers sighted the Japanese fleet. Below them, 3 of the enemy's 4 carriers were exposed, their decks full of aircraft being refueled and rearmed, the crews unaware of the death descending from above. The blue sky split open as McCluskey gave the order to dive.
SBD Dauntless bombers folded their wings and plunged toward the sea, screaming down at more than 200 knots. Pilots gritted their teeth against the crushing G-forces, the sun flashing across the canopies as they aimed their bombs at the carriers below. At 10:22 a.m., the first bomb struck the Kaga. A 1,000-pound bomb tore through the flight deck and detonated amid dozens of refueling aircraft, setting off a chain of explosions. Fireballs erupted across the ship, engulfing crewmen and aircraft alike. Seconds later, a Kagi was hit. One bomb penetrated her hangar and ignited aviation fuel, turning the carrier into a floating inferno. On Soryu, 3 direct hits ripped through her decks, detonating torpedoes and bombs stored below. The explosions were so violent that some sailors were blown into the sea. Those who survived could only watch in horror as their ships became blazing pyres. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally wounded. The air that moments earlier had been filled with the confident hum of Japanese aircraft was now thick with black smoke and the roar of secondary explosions. Flames reached hundreds of feet into the air. Survivors abandoned ship as ammunition cooked off and aircraft melted in the heat. Admiral Nagumo, stunned, could hardly comprehend what had happened. His flagship, Akagi, was burning uncontrollably. Communications broke down as ships turned desperately to avoid collisions. The once mighty Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was being destroyed before his eyes.
Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, aboard the Yorktown, the Americans cheered as radio reports of the hits came in. But the battle was far from over. One Japanese carrier still remained, Hiryu. Under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, Hiryu launched 2 counterstrikes that afternoon, determined to avenge his fallen comrades. The first wave of Japanese dive bombers found the Yorktown shortly after noon. Diving through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, they scored 2 direct hits, setting the carrier ablaze. The ship listed heavily, smoke billowing from her decks. Damage control teams worked furiously to save her, and miraculously, within an hour, the fires were brought under control. The Americans believed Yorktown had survived the worst, but Yamaguchi was not finished. A second strike of torpedo bombers, guided by radio reports from the first attack, arrived around 2:45 p.m. This time, Yorktown's luck ran out. 2 torpedoes slammed into her port side, flooding the engine rooms and knocking out power. The order was given to abandon ship. The proud carrier that had fought at Coral Sea and now at Midway was left drifting, her flags still flying. Despite her loss, Yorktown's sacrifice had drawn Japanese attention away from the other American carriers, giving Spruance and McCluskey the chance to deliver their own final blow. Late in the afternoon, around 5 p.m., a new wave of dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu. Yamaguchi's carrier had already launched her last aircraft and was preparing for another recovery when the Americans appeared. The bombers dived almost vertically through clouds of flak. Within seconds, 4 1,000-pound bombs struck Hiryu, tearing through her decks. Explosions consumed her from bow to stern.
Flames engulfed the bridge and hangars. Crewmen fought desperately to contain the inferno, but the effort was hopeless. Yamaguchi refused to abandon his ship. As the sun set over the Pacific, Hiryu burned until nightfall, then exploded and sank, taking Yamaguchi and most of her crew with her. By the end of June 4, 1942, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were either sunk or fatally damaged. Over 300 Japanese aircraft and many of their most experienced pilots were lost. The Kido Butai, which had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was annihilated in a single day. The Americans, though battered, still possessed 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, and had achieved one of the greatest naval victories in history. As night fell, the seas around Midway burned with oil and debris. Survivors clung to wreckage, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of explosions and the cries of men in the water. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto received the devastating reports with disbelief. His carefully constructed plan, designed to lure and destroy the enemy, had been turned against him.
He briefly considered continuing the battle, even sending his battleships into a night engagement, but his subordinates convinced him that the risk was too great. The remaining fleet turned westward and began the long retreat to Japan. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the victory reports with calm satisfaction. He knew the cost had been high, but the result was beyond expectation. For the first time since the war began, the United States had not only checked Japan's advance, but had destroyed its offensive striking power.
Midway had been saved, Hawaii was secure, and the tide of war had begun to turn. For the man who had fought it, the battle was an experience they would never forget. The blinding sun, the deafening roar of engines, the scream of dive bombers falling from the sky, the terrible beauty of ships burning on the horizon. Yet, even amid victory, they knew how close it had been. A few degrees of timing, a few minutes delay, and the outcome might have been entirely different.
By dawn on June 5, 1942, the waters around Midway were still strewn with burning oil and shattered wreckage, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and fuel. The Japanese fleet, battered and humiliated, was in full retreat. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato, wrestled with the reality that his brilliant plan had turned into a catastrophe. He had underestimated the enemy's resolve, intelligence, and capacity for surprise. The once invincible carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, no longer existed. The 4 sunken carriers represented not just ships, but the very heart of Japan's offensive power. Each had carried dozens of elite pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid, and the Coral Sea. Now they were gone, lost to the depths along with their aircraft, their experience, and their aura of invincibility. For Japan, the Battle of Midway was more than a defeat. It was a strategic disaster from which its navy would never recover. The loss of so many trained aviators proved irreplaceable. Japan's training system, already stretched thin, could not produce replacements fast enough, while the United States, with its vast industrial and training capacity, soon began launching new carriers and training hundreds of new pilots every month. By contrast, the Japanese could replace ships, but not men. Those who survived Midway would go on to fight in later battles at Guadalupe, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, but they would do so with younger, less experienced airmen and with a navy that had lost its edge. Admiral Nimitz, cautious and analytical, ordered patrols to search for any remaining Japanese carriers or battleships. On June 6th, aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet pursued the retreating enemy and located the damaged cruiser Mikuma, which had collided with her sister ship Mogami during the withdrawal. American bombers attacked relentlessly, setting Mikuma ablaze until she exploded and sank. The images of the burning cruiser, captured by reconnaissance aircraft, would later symbolize Japan's defeat at Midway. The Americans, however, did not escape unscathed. Yorktown, already crippled by bombs and torpedoes, was still afloat, a wounded giant drifting silently in the Pacific. Attempts to tow her to safety were underway when the Japanese submarine I-168 slipped past the escorts and fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, and another hit the destroyer Hamon, which sank within minutes. The final blow sealed Yorktown's fate. On the morning of June 7th, she rolled over and sank beneath the waves, her battle flag still flying. For the men who had fought aboard her, it was a bitter moment, but also one filled with pride. They knew their sacrifice had helped turn the tide of war. As the surviving ships returned to Pearl Harbor, the mood among sailors was one of exhausted triumph.
The United States Navy, which had been reeling just 6 months earlier, had now achieved what few had thought possible: the destruction of Japan's main carrier force. Admiral Nimitz called it our most important victory. Newspapers across America echoed his words. The victory at Midway electrified the American public, boosting morale and giving hope that the tide could indeed be turned in the Pacific.
For Japan, the defeat was shrouded in secrecy. The Imperial Navy initially reported a glorious victory to the public, withholding the truth of the losses. Only a small circle of officers and government officials knew the full extent of the disaster. But as weeks turned to months, the absence of the 4 carriers and thousands of sailors could no longer be concealed. In Tokyo, the mood shifted from overconfidence to quiet dread. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Japanese Navy since Pearl Harbor was shattered. The strategic consequences of Midway were profound. For the first time in the war, Japan was forced onto the defensive. No longer able to project power across the Pacific at will, its naval operations became increasingly constrained. Meanwhile, the United States seized the initiative. Within 2 months, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the first step in a long and brutal campaign of island hopping that would eventually bring them to the gates of Japan itself. In hindsight, historians often describe Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, and rightly so. Yet its outcome was not inevitable. The battle hinged on a series of narrow chances, decisions, and coincidences that could have gone either way. Had McCluskey not spotted the Arashi's wake, the dive bombers might never have found Nagumo's carriers in time. Had Nagumo launched his second strike a few minutes earlier, his decks might have been clear when the American bombs fell. Fate, skill, intelligence, and courage intertwined in those few critical minutes that decided the course of history. The technological and tactical lessons of Midway were also immense.
It proved beyond doubt that air power, not battleships, now dominated naval warfare. The great gun duels of the past had given way to battles fought over the horizon, where victory belonged to those who could see and strike first. Radar, signals intelligence, and cryptography became as vital as guns and armor. The U.S. Navy, learning from its experience, refined its carrier tactics, emphasizing coordination, air cover, and rapid response. Japan, however, failed to adapt quickly enough. Its rigid command structure and lack of integrated air defense left it vulnerable to the fast, flexible American task forces that would later sweep across the Pacific. The personal stories of Midway are as haunting as its strategic lessons. Pilots who took off knowing they might never return, sailors who fought fires on the burning decks, officers who watched helplessly as their ships sank, all became part of a legacy that transcended victory or defeat. Men like Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led Torpedo Squadron 8 into near-certain death, or Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, who chose to go down with his ship, these figures embodied the courage and tragedy of Midway. Their sacrifices gave the battle a human dimension that statistics alone cannot convey. In the years that followed, as the Pacific War dragged on, the memory of Midway continued to inspire. For the Americans, it was proof that determination and intelligence could overcome even the strongest adversary. For the Japanese, it was a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the high cost of strategic miscalculation.
Decades later, historians, filmmakers, and veterans would revisit the battle, each seeking to understand how such a brief encounter, just 4 days long, could so completely alter the balance of world power. When the war finally ended in 1945, the wrecks of the 4 Japanese carriers still lay silently beneath the Pacific, monuments to a vanished era. Divers and historians who later found them describe the eerie stillness of those underwater graves, the twisted steel and scattered relics of what had once been the mightiest fleet in the world. Today, the Battle of Midway remains not only a story of ships and planes, but of intelligence, courage, and the razor-thin line between triumph and disaster. It stands as a reminder that even in the vastness of the ocean, a handful of decisions made in moments of uncertainty can change the course of history forever.